minutes for this presentation. There's a series of fairly short ones here. I'm Al Stone on the LEG ACPI team. My colleague Naresh Bhatt also on the, well, I'm not sure what team you're on these days, but you're also in LEG, and has been instrumental in getting LUV working on ARM64. So next slide. Okay. So just a quick mention. The point of this is to really just talk about the things that we've done with ACPI compliance testing and with LuvOS, so that it's really very, very straightforward for you to test your firmware. The tests themselves are not complete, but it's a good starting point, and we're adding more as days go on. Those are all based on these standards. I'm not going to read them off to you. You've probably heard all of them, the initials before, but it's the key ones. SBSA, SBBR, UEFI, ACPI, and PSCI. I want to make sure we mentioned that as well. I think the other thing to be aware of too is that all of those have subsequent standards. So for example, in the ACPI spec, there's a bunch of references to PCI specs. So you need to be aware of those. But next one. Okay. So I don't know how these jokes will translate out, but basically the notion that there are enforced standards is really kind of ridiculous. There is no enforcement. It's mostly by what we refer to as the honor system. That you as vendors, we assume that you're going to do the right thing and you're going to follow the standards, and nobody really needs to come around and beat you with a large stick. Unfortunately, every now and then people do things that are just really bad, and somebody has to shout at them a lot and scream and yell and make them do the right thing. Sometimes people say, oh my gosh, we made a mistake, and fix it right away. But there's really no concrete thing that you can point to and say, these are the people that will make my life miserable if I don't obey the standards. So really, it's more self-discipline than anything else. There are some who may object to the last statement, but there are compliance tests in some places, but I mean, let's be honest. If you as an engineer are given the opportunity to work on new code and do exciting new things, or build compliance tests, which one are you going to volunteer for? You're going to go off and build cool things, right? So the compliance test suites, you have to be careful. They're not necessarily up to date. They're not necessarily well maintained. Some of them are better than others, but you know, there's not a lot of them, and they're not always the best quality. So next. Okay. The ones that we do have, some of them are fairly good. There's the SCT, which the UEFI forum has put together. There are individual tests, like BITS, I forget what that stands for, binary interface test suite or something like that. But it's a bit x86 specific, so it needs some porting. FWTS, I am really quite pleased with. I don't see Alex here this morning. Maybe we lost him. But Alex Hung is here. He's one of the upstream maintainers of it. And if you get a chance, just grab his hand and shake it and say thank you. It's quite well done. And where we've started at Linaro is we've approached this in two different ways. One is improving the tests as they are, and making sure that they are more comprehensive and more solid. And that's really kind of where we've focused on the firmware test suite. But the other key thing is just in basic scientific method, I want to make sure I control all my variables. So LuvOS provides me a way to know that I've got a consistent environment to run my test cases in, and know that it's not the environment that's the variable. Okay. Go ahead, thank you. All right, so recently, as in most open source projects, I had an itch, and this one was really bugging me. So I started hacking on FWTS, and there's a couple things that we've added to it. So the arch parameter, what that allows me to do is on my x86 machine, as much as possible, test firmware that was developed for other architectures. Or on those other architectures, test firmware that was developed for ARM64, right? It's sort of cross-testing. I couldn't figure out a better name for it, but it allows me to, independent of where I'm actually running the test suite, actually be able to look at firmware tables from different architectures. ACPI compliance. That parameter basically says that if a test from the test suite runs under this parameter, we've gone through and we've verified that everything in there is checking for ACPI compliance. There's a bunch of ACPI tests in FWTS, a lot. Many of them, though, are there to verify that somebody has not done something stupid that we have seen in the past. And that's okay, but that's not necessarily standards compliance. It can either be no difference or it can be a very big difference. But that's what that parameter allows us to do. And over time, what I'll be doing is making sure that there's more and more of those. What we have in there currently is full compliance tests for the MADT tables and all of their subtables. I believe there's 15 of them, 16 of them, for RSDP and for the FADT. Okay, so you use that parameter, run FWTS, and what you'll get is a synopsis of whether or not your tables actually comply with the standard at that point. As kind of subparts of that, there are, the reduced hardware mode has certain implications in other tables and in other contents of those tables. And there's some code in there to check to make sure that you're doing reduced hardware, at least initially, correctly. In the process, of course, we found some minor issues here and there with the test suite itself, and have fixed those. So, what does that look like? Oh, I love how presentation stuff fixes stuff for you. So the arch parameter, as you can see above, basically says this is the architecture I want to test the table, or I'm sorry, this is the architecture that these tables are for that I want to test. So this is something I do on my machine at home all the time, is I've got a bunch of ARM ACPI tables, and I can just point them, point FWTS at those tables and say test those tables. ACPI compliance, very similar, right? And if you'll notice, there's an arch parameter there as well, because ACPI compliance changes based on your architecture. So if I did not have that, it would run it on whatever the host architecture is, but that's now checking for ARM64 stuff like reduced hardware, for example. Okay. Excellent. This is a summary that you get out of it. There's, if you'll notice, there's 51 tests in the MADT subtable tests. I'm not sure that's enough. There's a lot of them, and they're complex. They've got interactions with all kinds of things. But this is just this general summary that you get out of it. Nothing terribly clever about it, but what you can see is just that there's simple things like the checksum test. There's a checksum in every table. It's amazing the number of operating systems that start up and never check the checksum. Okay. Revision test. One of the things that we're consistently finding is that the specification says one revision, but what people are actually shipping in their firmware may be literally, in some cases, decades old. Okay. But that's just an example. Go to the next one. When you actually start looking in the log, it just goes through this is just a detailed log of all of the things that it's checking for, right? So like in this case, you can see that it's looking at all the different MADT subtables. You know, is the table type defined? Is it the correct length? Does it have the right content? And sadly, I realized yesterday that there's no tests on this that actually failed. But, you know, guess what? It says failed. And we've been very good about trying to, not very good. We spent a lot of time trying to make sure that the failure messages actually tell you what you need to fix. Okay. So next one, please. Okay.
Thank you. So, what happens with LUV? Like, the LUV is a open embedded project which is driven by Intel. So, it's a Yocto-based project, and it's of course a distribution. There are pre-built images, LUV live images, which are available on our Linaro server. You can just download it and run it on your machines. Yeah, certainly there will be, these tests are packed into initRD. You can replace with your own custom kernel to run on your machines. So how to add a new test suite? It is just like same as adding any package. Whoever knows the open embedded development, they can add. It's in the same way. There's no difference. And the more informations are on our Linaro wiki, LUV web page, how to build, how the CI loop works, and where the images are available. These informations are there. Okay. Now, a few to-do list. One is Intel is like they are posting the net console feature, which is under discussion, and the netboot image creation. This we can do. Then bits actually does not use the latest grub source. This does not have the ARM64 support. I have been requesting from couple of months to update and use the latest Git repository of the grub or source of the grub. ChipSec is a test suite which is having some NDA. So it's not completely open source. So if they make it, we can try it on ARM64. And FWTS, yeah,
So I'll embarrass Naresh a little bit here because before he started on this, LuvOS did not run on ARM64. So he's done a lot of work to get it that far. And really the key thing is that if you think about it as just a test environment, like he said, you can add packages all you want, add new test cases all you want. It's actually quite handy. So it's now kind of it can be a standard testing environment for you. Okay, other FWTS stuff. Surprisingly, a large number of the firmware test suite tests are not even compiled on ARM64 at this point, and for good reason. If you think about the history of ACPI and what it's meant to do, some of the tests actually have x86 specific code in them, of course, right? Or in a couple of very rare cases, there's actually IA64 specific code. So those right now have mostly just been if-def'd out. Unfortunately, FWTS was one of them, so that was kind of why I worked on that table as well. But there's still, I think, 40 or 50 files in the system that need work. More ACPI compliance tests for more tables. I think all told, there's 60 plus tables in the ACPI spec. There's about a dozen that are critical to the SBBR, and I'll be trying to make sure that those have full compliance tests on them. So the required ones, absolutely. The recommended ones, I'll try to get to over time. There's a bunch of tables that may never have a compliance test just because of a lack of demand. So yeah, any of the SBBR tables, anything ARM specific. SBBR specific tests, there's some possibility for that. Charles and I have been talking about how to split up some of that work so that it's not all in one person's bucket. So there's probably some things we'll be able to talk about later as far as that goes. Another feature that I've tried to think through, one of the issues with ACPI is the different versions of the specification and the way those have been enforced over time. So you'll actually end up with cases where tables are actually showing as version 1, meaning the very first definition of the table, and those are actively being used and distributed out in the real world, but the current version in the specification is like 5 or 6. And all of the other intermediate versions have just been ignored or skipped. So is it possible to actually take the test suite and do just ACPI version 3 or ACPI version 4, something like that? That's a much longer term goal. It's more complicated than I thought it might be. Okay, next one. Okay, so final slide. Please help. There's a lot of tests that need to be done, a lot of work to be done. One of the things I would explicitly ask is if you can share firmware, please do so. Send it to me, my dog, Naresh. I don't care who you send it to, but send it to somebody so that we can actually use it. This is one of the problems with the test suite itself, is it does have some regression tests to make sure that the test suite is working correctly. But the more we can populate known good or known bad tables, the better we can make the test suite over time. And we just don't have a lot of them. Now, the good news is that the people that actually are the upstream maintainers do have a private repository of things that they cannot share, and it's fairly large, but we'd like to make a public repository of known good, known bad ACPI tables. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you what, if you send me tables, and even if they're bad, I won't tell anybody right off the bat, right? Okay, if you can get more access to hardware and firmware, please run the test, tell us what you find. And one of the more entertaining things about that is when I submitted the patches for the FWTS compliance tests, I got a nice note from a colleague that I used to work with in a previous life. And what she told me was that it was brilliant, because even with the patches and even with that patch not released as part of the upstream test suite, they had already found a bug in their MADT and were able to fix it before shipping the firmware, right? So it's like, oh, good, it's doing what it should do. And write more tests, please, 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 please. It's very, very straightforward to add tests to FWTS. Adding things into LuvOS is painless. Well, not painless, but okay. On a relative scale, it's very simple and straightforward. So yeah, anything you can do to help out with that, we would really appreciate. I think that's it, yeah? Okay. Questions? Lorenzo.
Dynamic tables, and I don't know if I think it should be. I know that there is some work ongoing on ACPI side to basically execute ACPI tables, well, within ACPI and debugger, and I don't know if there is any compliance test in particular for resource allocation and validating the CRS and well, the resource space. I think it would be quite useful.
Yeah, so, okay. So all of the content of the DSDT and SSDTs, because that's interpreted code, yes, that needs some sort of dynamic test to it. The debugger allows you to do that as long as you're running the test cases on the host that actually has the firmware supported for it, right? And this is why a bunch of things are if-deffed out, because the assumption is that you may not run it on the same host as the tables that you're testing. So that's one thing that needs to be fixed over time. There are some things we can do with some of the method execution right now that are not hardware dependent, right? So I execute this method, it needs to return a package. The package needs to look like this. But there's a bunch of them where it's going to tickle this register or set this bit someplace, and we're gonna have to see if we can figure out a way to do that or emulate it or something over time, I think.
Yeah, I mentioned that because, well, with discussions on PCIe, right? I mean, the point is, I think on x86, the Linux kernel, I mean, benefited in a way from Windows validation for CRS and stuff like that, which it's not really there for 64. I'm thinking something that it's really worth thinking about, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Agreed. I mean, there's some things you can do that are really straightforward, right? Just like testing for the presence of certain methods and things. But, you know, yeah, I would like to get to the point where we can actually do a dynamic test of that, and have it smart enough to realize, okay, well, I'm trying to run an ARM-specific dynamic test on x86, don't do that, or vice versa. But that's in progress, I guess I should say. Other questions?
I was just going to comment that the dynamic thing also gets hard because you might not just be testing ACPI. So, for example, if you do LPI states, then you're going to be testing PSCI on top of that. And
yeah, good point.
so it does get complicated. But I think, as you're saying, at least some static analysis on that could be done already, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Other questions? Not sure how we're doing on time. Because there's another session here at 10. Okay. About a minute. Okay. Well, if there's nothing else for Naresh or I, thank you. If you want to volunteer firmware or test later on, I'll be here all week. Thank you.